Welcome back to the show. Thank you for watching from Rwanda and all over the world. On October 1st, BBC broadcasted a documentary. It aired for the first time on the 1st of October. It is entitled Rwanda's Untold Story. Rwanda's Untold Story outraged so many people. It's a documentary that was produced by Jen Corbin, and we're going to discuss about it in depth. And we are going to actually have different ideas from these gentlemen. They are going to tell us what they feel as well as what their professional side of it says. Thank you so much. Let's go back now to the BBC documentary. How do you feel generally about it? Rwanda's Untold Story.
Well, like I mentioned earlier, that to me I don't find anything strange, because the motive force out of Jenny's documentary is what we should have to look at. What was her intentions to shoot that story, and then the aspect of airing it through BBC channel, that's another aspect. Mm-hmm. So the purpose, to me, I see it as a political. It's a political agenda. If you look at the figures within the documentary, then you can get the answer. Okay. You have Philip, the renowned Iberian genocide ideologue, who was being interviewed extensively, and the words he was using are no different from the earlier colonial era, including the neo-colonial regimes that were before RPF took over. Mm-hmm.
Well, Mr. Charles, we'll come back to the choice of, yes, of interviews that Jane Corbin actually decided. Mainly for now, I would like to know your feeling generally of the about that documentary when you watched it, you as a person, well, and then we'll come back to that.
It's not a matter of feeling, as far as I'm concerned. It's the issue of looking factual at it intellectually and look at it. What is the purpose of this documentary?
Okay. All right.
The purpose was a political fight waged by the colonial people, the former Belgian colonizers, who feel they were defeated. Their colonial agenda, which resulted into genocide, was being defeated. And therefore they have to fight. It's their fight. Okay. So that's my view. Yes,
fight their fight. What's your feeling?
My personal feeling is one of kind of a mild outrage about this documentary for a couple of reasons. I'm one of the 38 people who signed on to that original letter of researchers who sent a protest to the BBC, and my feeling about it is that it's an outrage not only to the survivors of genocide but to all of humanity. Genocide is a crime against humanity. It's all of our business to make sure that there is prevention of genocide from reoccurrence. The fact that you have external individuals who are promoting this denial story and this denial agenda makes me angry as an outside person, because in 1994 and in the previous massacres against Tutsi, these people were nowhere to be found to raise their voice. Now, after the deed is done, you find them trying to cover up and deny. So I'm outraged as an individual about external people who are not implicated in the issues here now rubbing salt in the wounds of the victims, and then also offending us who are human rights supporters by giving a stage for deniers and also trying to justify giving that stage.
We'll come back and talk about the stage of denial. Again, Galoba, do you have any specific feeling about the documentary, Rwanda's Untold Story?
Yes. It took me a week to watch that documentary. I never watched it on the day it was broadcast. But my son, who did, kept sending me running commentaries on WhatsApp about what he was watching. But when I watched it, it became very clear to me. I think that this documentary had a political motive. And it's evident when you watch it. You see that President Kagame is very much in the frame. It is purporting to tell an untold story. It is purporting to talk about what happened in this country, but clearly you can see that there is somebody being targeted by this. And President Kagame is very much a target. And there are very specific statements that are made throughout the documentary that focus specifically on him as a person. Now that raises the question, what is the reason behind this documentary? Now, I discovered also that when this woman, Jane Corbin, came to Rwanda, she came here under false pretenses. She'd never made clear what her objective was. She portrayed it as her mission as having come here to cover the genocide commemoration. I understand the person who was helping her, the Rwandan person she worked with, never got a straight story of what this was about. And also, and I don't know whether this is true, but I have heard it, I haven't confirmed it with that person because I don't know who it is, but I understand that he received a phone call from somebody at the BBC before they broadcast the documentary, warning him that this documentary might put him into trouble, so he might want to consider leaving the country. Now, all this adds up to a very, very bizarre phenomenon here. Why did Jane Corbin make that documentary? Who was behind it? Now, the BBC has gone on and claimed very pompously that they had a duty to broadcast it. I don't know a duty to whom, but clearly this documentary had a political motive. But it was also quite shocking in the sort of the callousness of the statements that are made by people who are interviewed. Philip Rentiens with his big statement about President Kagame being a war criminal. The young woman who was interviewed was 10 years old, and who knows how many people were involved in the killings. I mean, those of us who are parents and have had 10-year-old children or 12-year-old children know that it's very unlikely that they would be so aware of what's happening around them as to be so specific about figures of that kind. So the whole thing, to me, it raised very many questions. Very many questions, yeah. And I thought that it is cruel, it's callous, it doesn't do what it purports to set out to do. It goes on to offend, it goes on to insult, it goes on to make political statements that one would think the BBC would not want to indulge itself in. That's one of the things that but you had already changed your mind about the big media houses, or it's one of the things that completely made you change your mind? No, personally, my view of the BBC has been changing over the last 20 years. And I must admit that Rwanda is responsible for really the decline of the BBC's reputation in my eyes, because this is just one of a series of reports coming out of the BBC that I personally would think this is either very shallow or irresponsible. All right, we'll come back to the details in that documentary. Pass on to you, Mr. Colin. What is your feeling about the documentary when you watched it?
I think in addition to what he's just said, when I watched the documentary the first time, you could see that is fiction, you know, right from the beginning, where they tried to create this scenario of some kind of Hollywood movie, right? Then from then on, because so many facts were misrepresented, they were trying to create a way of convincing people using that fictional approach, and that made it really flawed and really annoying, in that not only Rwandans were outraged about it, people all over the world, different people. As long as you're objective and you look at how such a sensitive issue is being handled, it's quite annoying. So that probably explains why people are so bitter with the BBC, because it's considered to be one of the reputable media organizations we have in this world, and they get to every corner of the world. So the expectation is that they should be as professional as possible. So when something like that is aired on a supposedly respectable media house, it questions what the motive could have been. It looks like it left lots of questions. I mean, when you watched it, I was wondering, that documentary was actually released on the 1st of October, which is a very important date as far as RPF is concerned. Is that a coincidence, or there could have been a reason behind it? What do you think? No,
exactly like you're saying, there might have been a reason to it. To portray RPF's victory as a non-starter, as wrong, as actually not real. Because if you look at the images that are patched up, if you look at the figures that were given and the stories and the statements, but before we even come to that, BBC itself has actually, it is objectivity. Once I used to be a stringer for BBC in Rwanda for a short period. But every trained journalist would like to work with the BBC would have liked to work with it. But now this time around, when you see that kind of objectivity, which it seems to me has been thrown out of the window, then there is a problem. Turning it into a platform to propagate genocide ideas, which originally was prohibited. And I remember that when we train, things that are anti-humanity should not be propagated through such a respectable, reputable media house. Now, the coincidence, the planning of airing that documentary was propaganda. Propaganda to defeat the statement that would have been made to remember, to commemorate the victory of RPF, to talk about Rwanda in a very positive way, but they wanted to deviate the attention. Created, I remember earlier I told you that about the media creates new perceptions, changes over time to serve the purpose of the owners. And I think that is the role that the BBC was alluding to.
Tim, do you have the same feeling about the reason it was aired on the 1st of October?
Well, it seems, of course, very suspicious for that date. But we could find out very simply by asking.
Yeah, by asking, yes.
You know, if this is something that they normally have a show on that particular day of the week or, you know, in the month. But as far as, you know, the actual choice of it, I can't say. I mean, I find it quite curious that it is on that particular day that it was first aired.
All right, well, we will find out. And what is, you know, as you, like you said, you watched the documentary and it raised so many questions. This is the same BBC that 20 years ago, during the genocide against Tutsi, it did a tremendous job because it reported. The whole world actually knew about the genocide because BBC talked about it. Did you yourself watch?
Oh yes, we saw footage, and it was one of the few Western media that were still in the country that were recording genocide in action. So it's quite, you know, surprising that, first of all, there is somehow an untold story that BBC, with all of its expertise and prowess, waited 20 years to discover. So what about the intervening 19 years of being an investigative journalist that all of a sudden something escaped you for so long that you bring it forward now? I have some specific things to say about the sourcing of the documentary, and the BBC has responded to a group of researchers who lodged a formal complaint for the airing of it and the refusal of BBC management to make apology and to make amends for showing that documentary and giving a stage to genocide deniers, and then to defend the choice to give them that stage. And part of that response is saying, well, you know, we engage in debate and discussion about new things that have come to light. Well, among the so-called 8 or 10 stages of genocide is genocide denial, and we are very much strongly in that stage now, and it's unfortunate to see the co-opting of important institutions, formerly trusted, incredible institutions like the BBC, providing a stage, lending a voice to these deniers who are purveyors of known falsehoods. And just to follow up a bit, you know, the persons who are central for these charges against the RPF and the attack on President Kagame are people who BBC in the documentary describe as people from the inner circle, former associates. Well, these individuals, their credibility is never challenged in the documentary, and they're fugitives from justice. They're defectors from the military. And the BBC's own coverage and previous reporting by the BBC says that these particular defectors are not credible sources. And Jane Corbin should have known that. Her own media organization that commissioned her to do this documentary have found those very sources to be non-credible.
Other than that, there could also have been the other side, because objectivity means reporting both sides. If they reported those on, then they could have the other side. Then they could have said, okay, the objectivity of BBC is okay. But now it's only one side.
We'll definitely come back to the accuracy and actually credibility of that documentary. At this point, I want to pick your brains and see if you probably understand why the sudden change of mind 20 years later. Do they have any motive, any reason, Mr. Golobert?
It's very difficult for me to speculate on what their motive might be, but I think for me what I found disappointing is that there's a great deal that has happened in this country in the last 20 years, which is untold, actually. A great deal. I say to people, Africans included, a few weeks ago I was talking to senior officials of the government of South Sudan and telling them about Rwanda's constitution and how there are several political parties serving in the government of Rwanda, and how the Rwandan constitution dictates that there should be power sharing in this country, and they have never heard of it. And they asked me, how come we don't know about it? Now, I would be happy if the BBC told the world this untold story of power sharing in this country. There is a great deal going on at the community level where people meet and discuss issues to do with their own well-being and get to uplift themselves. There are so many untold stories in this country that the BBC could have credibly put out as untold stories rather than recycling tired platitudes about all kinds of things. Now, I think that the other thing that it might be happening here is that there are people out there who are certainly angered by what is happening in Rwanda. Rwanda in 1994 was never supposed to recover. Rwanda was written off in 1994.
As
there
a failed
are
state.
many people who made predictions. People like Philip Renchens. He didn't think the post-genocide government would survive. It has survived for 20 years.
Yeah.
These people are angry. Their predictions never came to pass. So they must find a way of damaging what is happening because they are full of embarrassment. All the things that they said 20 years ago haven't happened. Rwanda, which was supposed to be a failed state, is not a failed state. Rwanda is a successful, strong, organized African state, an exception in many ways. So I think that Jane Corbyn was sold this story that somehow here was a scoop, something that we don't know about Rwanda. And I think that Jane Corbyn probably wanted to be famous. She thought that this was the documentary that would boost her fame or whatever. But she really did put her foot right in the wrong place.
Yeah. Well, all those are possibilities. But now, since you're talking about Philip, let's talk about the choice of interviewees in this documentary. I'll pass it.
Before you go to
Yes.
that, can I make one follow-up
Oh,
on,
sure thing.
because you asked a question
Yes.
about what the potential motive might be.
Yes.
Towards the end of the documentary, the commentator, Jane Corbyn, comes on and mentions that there's some $400+ million of foreign aid that goes to Rwanda each year, and that the UK is the largest contributor of that foreign aid that comes to Rwanda. So in my mind, given, as you have correctly stated, this is a politically motivated documentary, one of the things I think they're trying to do is to reach UK citizens to say that this is a bad regime, this president is a suspect person, and therefore we ought not to send our tax dollars to support this government and the development that's going on here. I think that is part of the motive that comes across.
Access to finance?
Pardon?
They are trying to cut the access to
Oh yes. Well,
finance.
remember the UK at one point did suspend some aid to Rwanda over the M23 issue, and I think that agenda has not gone away, and it was clearly stated. I mean, if this is supposed to be a documentary about even revision of the genocide, to talk about what happened and didn't happen, to have a very lengthy section, as you rightly identified, as an attack on the government and on the president, and then to say towards the end of that documentary, by the way, here's all the money that's going there, and the UK is one of the largest contributors to that $400+ million of annual aid that comes to Rwanda. It's a point and an idea and, if you will, an argument that she's wanting to plant in the minds of that audience in UK.
It's a public perception.
And actually, in 2012, before the British suspended aid, there was another documentary that came out on another British broadcaster, Channel 4. The journalist came here, and again, towards the end of that documentary, he said, look, we are paying our money to this criminal regime and so on and so forth. Now, the newspapers in the UK, and I was in the UK during that time, all the newspapers were again sounding the same drums. The dictatorship, murderous regime, why are we giving them money? And shamefully, some of the newspapers were telling lies. Lies, shameless lies. And I can tell papers like the Daily, what is it called? Not the Guardian. There is not the Daily Telegraph. It's a tabloid, Daily Mail. There was a story in the Daily Mail, which I have a son who lives in the UK, but he spends his summers here. Now there was a story in the Daily Mail which he sent to me, and the Daily Mail was claiming that there is a torture chamber in Chichuchiro where I live, and that people are beaten up there in those torture chambers, and you can hear them screaming if you're at the Serena. This appeared in the Daily Mail.
For real? Like that?
I can give you the story.
With the same words you just used?
I'm telling you, Chichukiro, where I live, there is supposed to be a torture chamber. People are beaten up, and you can hear them screaming if you're at the Serena.
Okay.
This is coming out in a British newspaper.
Wow.
So, yeah, this is just part of that game. We are coming towards 2017. There is going to be a debate in this country about transition and so on. They are preparing the ground. You can see it coming. This is the motivation of things like these. Philippe Rentgens, he's fighting. I have personally told him he's fighting a losing war because he's going to lose it. But they are fighting a war. Yeah.
The choice of interviews.
Yeah, I mean the choice, you could see it. Kayumba, Rudasingwa, Rentgens, Davenport, and whoever. You can see it. Why is it that they never interviewed Fago Kin, the BBC journalist who was here during the genocide? He was in this country. He has written a book about it. Philippe Rentgens wasn't here. Davenport and Stam were not in this country during the genocide. Kayumba and Rudasingwa were here, but now we know what their motivations are. And if you look at that documentary again and listen to the way they answer questions, they're not being very specific. When they asked Kayumba how he knew about the claims he was making, he just says he was in a position to know. What does that mean? This chap who claims to have been President Kagame's bodyguard and who was therefore in a meeting where certain things were being discussed, for God's sake, who would take a bodyguard into a meeting that discusses something so sensitive? I mean, does Jane Corbyn have any common sense at all?
Okay. Well, do we know the relationships between the bosses and bodyguards? I don't know. Yeah. What do you have to say about the choice of the interviewees?
To me that was very unethical and very unprofessional. Even if because the impression that the documentary gives, that the BBC has become a platform of opposition groups. Even if it is within their right to do that, but let them, like they have been in the past, get the other side of the story, get other credible people who can tell the rest of the story. But here you have a monologue over of one single-minded people, backed up by those genocide ideologues like Philip. I mean, what do you expect? What can't you see? The interpretation is very clear that there is a war they are waging against Rwanda, using the BBC as a tool. To me, it gave me an impression that these guys are already in the field fighting a government, which they call a regime, a Madras regime, and all sorts of names, and then they are backed up by their sponsors. And there's no doubt that Jane and the company were on the payroll of those people who don't want to see a good thing about Rwanda.
Speaking of the war that they are trying to organize around Rwanda, there is in the documentary, about the 15 last minutes of the documentary, a clear attack on President Kagame. Is that a tool that they are using to destabilize? Or is there a specific reason to attack President Kagame? I'll start with you, Colin.
By the way, before you call the answers,
yeah,
it is also against, I think, the international protocols. You are portraying a head of state in that manner, calling him a murderer and a killer, using such a powerful media institution like BBC. To me, I think somehow there is a way the BBC can be taken to task. It has never happened. I've never seen. I told you earlier that I ever worked for the BBC. And as a trained in journalism during when I was a student, and when I was practicing journalism, when I was teaching journalism, I never saw something like that.
Back to the question that you asked, I think that's obvious. There's practically no need of debating it so much, because right from the onset, that was one of the objectives that any viewer can see, looking at the sources they selected, ignoring people who were actually here. I know Tim was talking about footage. There's a gentleman, I think is Nick Hughes, who is one of the people who recorded footage of actual killing that was along the Rugunga Road.
Yes.
Even in that documentary, that footage was used. And when he was writing about it, he was saying that he was running out of battery, so he would only record what he felt would portray the story, right? So as he was recording, he managed to get that part of the actual killing, but then he monitored what was going on. You know, there were trucks that would pass by and sort of supervise if the killings were actually being done efficiently, you know? So he could see that with his eye. And in his explanation, he was saying that the way things were being carried out would remove any doubt from someone that this whole thing was planned. And the documentary attempts to portray the picture that this was spontaneous, you know. And then when you look at the sources, I mean, for anyone who has done basic journalism, if someone is aggrieved, if someone has a bone to pick, the story they are going to tell you is going to create the picture like they're the most innocent and they're being victimized. It's just a basic principle. You have to be suspicious of such people. Of course, there's no problem. They can use them as sources, but the credibility of using them is really questionable. And if you look at the values that the BBC goes for, that documentary threw out of the window all their values.
Oh yeah,
I think that was what was most frustrating.
We are now talking about the values, the credibility, accuracy of a real story, or you know, the few values that a media house that tells the truth should have. So, if you could take me through just a few of them, like a real story, what should it have? You know, like those things we read, a real story is supposed to be balanced, supposed to be this and that.
Well,
how is it supposed to look like?
I'll follow up on the issue of credibility of sources and then come to what the traditional practice has been. Now, in a documentary, you may have a bit more of leeway because there's some narration that's required. And I think this is one of the things that gives away the BBC's standing in this. Now, we have to say the BBC because the BBC commissioned, reviewed, and aired that documentary. And when it was brought to their attention that it amounts to supporting genocide denial, the BBC wrote back to those people who complained and said, no, it's not, we stand behind it. So whatever is portrayed in that documentary, now we can say it's something that the BBC finds credible and believes in. Now, apart from choosing biased sources, anti-government sources, and presenting them as political opposition when they're really fugitives and defectors, there is what the narrator herself says, not just the mouth of the chosen sources, but how she characterizes and contextualizes. One example, at one point she said, the genocide memorials in Rwanda reinforce the official government story that the majority of the victims were Tutsis. This is not a source being quoted, this is the narrator, Jane Corbin, making that statement. And in my mind, that equates to genocide denial because there's no doubt that the majority of the victims were Tutsis, and she's trying to question the veracity of that fact. And so she gives herself away, and it touches, as you said, what are the practices, what are the principles of objective reporting? And there's no excuse for it because in a documentary you have much more time to find balanced sources, to challenge the sources, to get the facts right, and to report as accurately as possible. And so you see the narrator, the official BBC organ, taking a position on a particular issue that has been identified, both researchers, sociologically, legally, as genocide denial when you start questioning the number of victims and the identity of victims who were targeted for extermination.
Yeah, we'll come back to the specific indicators of genocide denial. You will take us through. You wanted to say something, Mr. Kolova, about what Tim just said. The whole idea of attacking and making it look like what we thought wasn't true is actually the truth. You know, the perception that it wants to give.
Well, I agree with everything that Tim said, and I think that the BBC have been very keen to claim that somehow the fact that they interviewed a genocide perpetrator and that the fact that they went and filmed in Murambi, that is evidence that they were not biased, that they were giving both sides of the story. But that's a very clever manipulation because the most of this story is casting doubt on what people have conducted serious research in Rwanda, on what people who were here and observed what happened have been saying all along. Because having cast doubt not only on the number of victims, but also on their identity, having trotted out this canal that somehow the RPF committed to the atrocities,
yes,
you have already done the damage. Now, it doesn't matter if you go and do a tokenistic interview of one genocide perpetrator, and then you go to Murambi, and one of the questions you ask is, why are these bodies being preserved in this way? Because that's one of the questions she asks. Yes. So this documentary, I will underline it again, this documentary had a purpose. This was a political documentary. It was a motivated documentary, calculated to achieve certain objectives. And the interviewees were chosen very carefully because she could have chosen others in this region, Tanzanians, Ugandans who were here during the genocide. She could have interviewed those. But she very deliberately avoided even interviewing genocide survivors themselves. That again gives the BBC away. Yeah. And whichever grounds they want to use to protest and claim that, oh no, they have lived up to the values they purport to treasure, I'm sorry, the BBC's reputation has been dragged through the mud by this documentary.
Gentlemen, thank you so much for this in-depth analysis. We are going to the last part of this discussion shortly, where we'll be talking about the allegations, the specific allegations, and using even numbers, and what they call facts of what could have happened, and all those are in the documentary. And we have asked Rwandans what they actually think about this documentary, Rwanda's Untold Story, that was aired on the 1st of October on BBC, and this is what they said.
I watched the BBC documentary. My take as a Rwandan woman, the claims made in the film are unfounded. The documentary is full of lies and blatant bias, with a view to distorting the Rwandan history. I was in refugees camps in the Congo, and I was grown enough to know what went on in the camps. I still remember how the Inkotanyi came to repatriate us. I was with my husband, and he was incredibly ill. They carried him on the back up to the airfield, alongside other people that they helped to repatriate. Frankly, whenever I watch that film, it makes me angry, because the only thing RPA soldiers did was to repatriate people from the Congo. If they didn't, many would have died in the camps. We are grateful to them. The claims made in the film are groundless. They had a premeditated motive when they set out to make the film. Their objective, as evidenced, was to smear the person of the country's president and destroy the unity that Rwandans have achieved so far. Because they turned the army that stopped the genocide into killers. In the film, RPF soldiers did not repatriate refugees, but killed them. Yet hundreds of thousands of Rwandans were repatriated en masse from DR Congo. They even brought us back home, yet we had gone deeply in the jungles. For your information, nobody would have made it back. Had they left us in the jungle, we would have died, because we would walk for a week and eventually come back where we set out initially. They carried on the back those of us that were ill. How come they talked to that young girl who barely knows anything, given her age? Her account of events presumably is something she was told by other people. Their agenda, in my view, was to distort history and belittle the genocide. Had they talked to me as an eyewitness or any other eyewitness, we would have given them first-hand account of what we saw. We are protesting against the BBC's attempt to bring about divisionism among its Rwandans and embolden the perpetrators of the 1994 Rwandan genocide committed against the Tutsis. We want to show to the world the truth about what happened in Rwanda. It is not up to the BBC to show the world what happened in Rwanda. As Rwandans, especially the youth, we know where we came from, we know how far we have gone, and we know where we want to go. The documentary undermines our president's reputation. The whole world knows about the remarkable achievements he has helped us to realize. Peace, unity, prosperity. It defies my understanding. We are really saddened. We call upon the whole world to join us in the protests. As women, we bear the brunt of suffering whenever there is war or when peace is undermined in our country. So we want to maintain peace in our country as our president has been doing. The BBC should be punished. The concerned journalists and editors should be fired. We cannot tolerate people who undermine peace and bring about divisionism. Those days are over in our country. We don't want that at all. We know the person who brought us peace back in our country, and we shall support him up until we die. Media should teach people to be united and live in harmony. However, the journalism that the BBC does borders on that of RTLM. You know what RTLM did in this country? It did nothing but incite hatred by Hutus against Tutsis. It played a huge role in inciting Hutus to kill Tutsis during the genocide. So I strongly condemn the BBC. Despite its supposed experience, it is shameful. The BBC should not have dared to make such a film that plunges Rwandans back into divisionism. It denies the genocide perpetrated against the Tutsis and attempts to support the double genocide theory. Yet in Rwanda, there was one genocide committed against the Tutsis. It was planned, the evidence is there, and the international community did recognize it due to how it was planned, executed, and eventually stopped. Besides, the genocide happened in broad daylight and was stopped by Rwandans. How dare they blatantly belittle it? It is shameful. There should be a regulatory entity. I don't know whether there is one, but in Rwanda we have the Media High Council. In my opinion, though, there is a need to have in place a similar international entity to punish any media house with such conduct. With such an entity in place, media houses should air factual stories. In addition, any media that seeks to bring about divisionism and undermine unity amongst Rwandans should, in my view, be penalized. I call upon upcoming journalists not to consider BBC journalists their role models. They may have more experience, but this does not imply they are better than you. It's really shameful. It is a shame. No media should behave in such a way, locally and globally. The filmmakers had an agenda, and that agenda was to discredit Rwanda Defense Forces and to cause offense to Rwandans because they made sure it was aired on the day we commemorate the heroes that liberated Rwandans, stopped the genocide, put an end to insurgency, and went to DR Congo to repatriate Rwandan refugees, of whom I was part of. Undoubtedly, the film was intentionally aired on that day to damage the revered reputation of our armed forces. As regards to the former Rwandan officials that featured in the documentary, why did they not make those statements when they were still in the country? Now, due to the malpractices they were involved in when they were still in office, such as embezzlement of public funds, they only started making such allegations once they were abroad. As a leader, I believe no official should apply double standards. I, Mureshyankwano Marie Rose, my word should remain unchanged. I may be occupying this post, but I will not keep it forever. If today I'm a member of parliament, it doesn't mean I'm the only one capable amongst the 12 million Rwandans. Someone else can fill this position. I cannot exhibit such conduct. And that's what I wish for every official. Every person has to believe in something, an ideology they believe in. My ideology makes me believe in RPFs, which has now become the national ideology of unity of Rwandans, of the Rwandan spirit. It is that ideology that incited them to find us in the forests, and without looking at the size of the nose to identify us as Hutus and kill us. Instead, they rescued us and brought us back home. That built the Rwandan spirit in me. I was freed from the Hutu enclosure. I felt, aside the unity of Rwandans and to love a Rwandan and to be patriotic, there is no other language I can now listen to. And that is what I wish for leaders, not to have double standards. They should not put their personal interests first. They should rather prioritize national interests. There is no other interest than to reconcile Rwandans and to stand united and to be a Rwandan. Only that. We should desist from other things and divisionism.
imyaka 7 tudahinga
umudozi mfite atelier twishyuye amafaranga yacu
ndarya ibintu bitagira isupu
ntabwo yavomaga amazi
uzanshakira